Welcome to Hope and Heresy, Life on the Religious Left, where we wrestle with contemporary issues using history and theology as our guides.
Our task is to reclaim religion for everyday people who want to live meaningfully without letting arbitrary doctrine or oppressive religious practice prevent us from asking big questions about our complicated world. I'm Reverend Sarah Lindsay.
And I'm Reverend Peggy Clark, and we're Unitarian-Universalist ministers broadcasting from Community Church of New York, here in New York City.
Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Sarah. It's been a long time.
I know. Happy 2022.
Yeah.
Yeah, new year. And we are starting with some fun and uplifting topics. No, so we're starting with eschatology, not to be confused with scatology or scatological. Eschatology, right, deals with what happens when we die, what happens at the end of time. It's sort of the end days conversation.
We are. Well, and we're talking today specifically about death. What happens after you die? And of course, on the one hand, the answer is, I don't know. Nobody knows. And we move on. But that's a completely unsatisfying answer.
Yes, it is a deeply unsatisfying answer, and we can certainly dig into why it's deeply unsatisfying. But you were sharing a story about a recent conversation.
I had this congregant who used to talk to me every once in a while about things that mattered to her, and this time she sort of made an appointment. She really wanted to talk, and she asked me, "What happens when you die?" And I said, "I don't know, and we don't know," and she was clearly distressed by my answer, and said, "Well, but don't you think it's possible that people really stay here, that they're with us, and that maybe even sometimes we can see them, or sometimes we can hear them, or they make themselves known?" And because her energy shifted the way that it did, I said, "Yeah, sure. I mean, we don't know, right? So not knowing means sometimes, anything is possible." And then the more she talked, it became really clear that her best friend had died and left behind two young children. And it became very important to her, something she probably hadn't thought about much until then, but now was feeling like it was really important that people die and that they continue to live in some fashion and are still present and accessible to us. I think that the question of what happens after you die is so much more than the rational, we don't know, right? So Confucius and Siddhartha Gautama, and they gave us these really rational responses, like, why? I mean, Confucius said something like, "Why are you talking about something you'll never have an answer to? Don't waste your time." And Gautama said, "Take the arrow out of your back first before you start worrying," right? The idea was like, you are currently suffering. This is what you need to pay attention to. And I tend to sort of fall into that category, except that the question is so personal and powerful, and the reality of death is so unbearably painful sometimes that we require more from
I think that's it. I think you've hit on it, right? It's a combination, I think, of the unbearability of the pain, but also our inability as humans to conceive of time in certain ways, right? So we understand ourselves and our knowing and our existing, and we can't really comprehend what it means to say, before we came to be and after we are done being, there's sort of eternity on either side. And it's hard for us to fathom that eternity would be a thing we didn't experience. And so then if you have this sort of, if you can't move out of, I will continue to be a knowing thing, right? Then I can't bear to think that on the other side of my existing, where I'm still knowing, I know, but I can't be there. Or I know, but I can't feel my people around me, or what, right? Like there's this desire. And so I think people like the Buddha, right, are like, we won't know, we won't be, we won't, right? Like there's some notion of like, if you can get to that place. And it's fascinating to me, right? Because my children, one of them is very clearly like, I'm afraid of death, but I'm not afraid of death because when I'm dead, I'll be dead and I'm not going to know what's happening. So who cares? He's afraid of other people dying and having to bear the pain of other people dying, right? But he's like, whatever, I'll be in the ground eaten by worms feeding the earth. I don't, and it's this really interesting, but not everybody's constitutionally capable of that, right? Because one of them is like, when I get reincarnated as a dog, and I'm like, who taught you reincarnation, right? And so I think that there's sort of some people whose brains are why I don't know, maybe it's that fundamental, right? Who can do that turn, or maybe it's discipline. Maybe it's a matter of, if you discipline yourself enough to sort of take the arrow out and live in the moment and make this as good as possible. But I do think there's something about time that's involved in this, and there's something about the pain of separation and the belief that when you're dead you won't belong, right? That you'll be sort of out in the world unbelonging. And I think that maybe makes it really hard for folks to imagine that we just poof and that's it,
And so I think we create these stories, but historically we've created many mythologies around what happens when you die. And some of them are elaborate, and some of them, a lot of them really have implications around how we're supposed to live. Like,
Right.
it feels like, if I were to think of a common thread, there is this idea of some kind of universal system of justice, a cosmic, so that you're going to get what you deserve in some fashion, which may also help us to balance living in a world of great injustice, so that we create these multi-tiered worlds that happen afterwards, right? So maybe a reincarnation system and coming back as different things, or it may be like the heaven, hell, purgatory system, or like reverse Styx, like there are so many possibilities. And all of them seem to kind of hinge on who have you been, how have you behaved, how have you treated other people and animals in the world, and that will determine what's next for you.
Yeah, I just want to pause for 1 second to share, like, so whenever my kid talks about reincarnation, I think about how I was taught in especially sort of like Hindu reincarnation systems, at least classically, right? You wanted to be reincarnated as a man and you want to be reincarnated in a certain caste and whatever. And I look at my like white boy children and I'm like, you're at the highest thing. You don't need to. Anyway, I have like a funny little, and I don't believe that. I don't believe that, but I have this funny little moment in my head when it happens. But yes, we build all these systems up because we want to capture something that we don't understand, right? And that we can't. And so we make a story about how it works. And I often think, Peggy, I don't know if you've ever read the C.S. Lewis Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Okay, so
yeah, that one too. Yeah.
Right. So that whole series, right? In grad school, I reread those in like a children's religious literature class. And people sort of forget because they read that first one, which is like wildly Christological, but also just like a good yarn, right? But if you keep reading, they're super racist, like super horrible. And you get to the end, and it depicts a very Christian sort of story about when you die, you will be judged, and you're going to either funnel off this way to heaven or funnel off that way to hell for eternal punishment, right? And I think there's a real. And Susan, one of the sisters, I always remember this, right? I barely remember anything about these books, but I remember Susan gets funneled off because she wore stockings and lipstick, right? She wore makeup, going to hell, and it's such an interesting. So your point about what it does is there's almost this way in which we envision the afterlife as a way to manage this life. And by that, I mean, manage people into a very narrow vision of what's appropriate and okay, and what's considered good, right? Even my little story about thinking about white men as the top of the like reincarnation system, like it creates a narrow vision of what's best and what's proper and what's going to make sure you're not like tortured for eternity.
Well, that's the whole opiate of the people, right? I mean, this is
Right.
a fabulous way to control people. You promise them something you could never prove happens,
Right.
but if you create the narrative and you reinforce the narrative so often, so clearly, institutionalizing the narrative so that people feel compelled to work within the system you've created for them.
Which is interesting, right? Because all it's really doing is preying on our fear and our inability to conceive of ourselves as finite and yet still powerful, right? As contained within a specific moment in time, but that doesn't deny our value or importance, right? Like, I think that's part of it too, is that we get this notion that like, in order for our lives to matter, they have to be long or big or something, right? And they don't, but it all just patterns around this, like, how do we assuage fear or use fear as a tool, right? And how do we make people, you know, marginally comfortable with death? This is, I don't know. I am actually curious how you have conversations with your child about death.
You know, my father died when he was 2, and my husband's father died when he was 6. So and then not long after that, my mother had a stroke, and while she hasn't died, she's a completely different person than who she knew him to be. And it feels like she's moving toward death just very slowly. So it's actually really been a part of his life, and he's lost 2 dogs in his life already. So in a lot of ways, he's more present to death than I find other kids his age. And it doesn't completely seem to scare him. It feels like it's just part of what he knows happens in the world. At the same time, he doesn't seem like stunned or shocked by it, but it does seem to me that he hasn't created a system around it, right? He hasn't like said what happens, or like he doesn't talk a whole lot about it. It just feels like it actually feels very Buddhist, right? The way that the Buddhists kind of make the youngest child set the flame that burns the body as a way of like bringing children into the story of death really early. That's been true for him, as and because of that, it's this sort of like he just has accepted it and hasn't really reflected a whole lot on it. Hasn't been so sudden that he like suddenly needs answers. It's just kind of
Part of life.
Yeah, and of course with COVID and so many people dying and so many people sick that we know, he's like, sometimes life really sucks.
But see, I think in the course of human history, right, if you consider that for most of human existence, humans have died much earlier than we do now. Death was a routine. I mean, and the survival rate of children was like 1 in 4 until the 20th century or something insane, right? I'd have to look that up. But like, that's my point, is death was a much more routine, much more part of life, much more. And I'm not saying like it was in those times that crazy systems got developed about what it meant and where you went and stuff. I'm not saying that like those idyllic times when people died frequently. I just mean that there is a way that like our generation and our children's generation don't actually have to actively face it regularly, right? Like I know people who made it to 18, 19, 20 years old before even a grandparent died, right? They had no childhood experience, no exposure aside from movies and whatever. But I think that's an interesting, that like, can we sort of teach the unknowing, right? Can we collectively just sort of live in that place where we can say we don't know, there's different possibilities, but we don't know. All we know is it's a part of life, it's part of the cycle, and it's going to happen to everyone. And is that enough? Can that be enough if we teach it as enough, right? If instead of overlaying onto that everything else, can we just let that be?
I don't think so.
No, okay.
And the reason is that I think that we are story making people. And I think that even when things make complete sense, I mean, how many times in my life? It's been like 100,000 times in my life when things make complete sense. They're totally rational. Everyone has all the information they need, but without a good story, it doesn't matter. And for something like death that creates so much anxiety, I think that we often need those stories. Now, with that said, my father's mother died when he was 10 years old, and the stories never really worked for him, and he let go of it. He was like, you're just dead. Like, what matters is the people who are still living. Like, we're the ones who are suffering. We're the ones with the loss. Where they go doesn't matter because we'll never know, and it doesn't affect us anyway.
See, this is my point. I'm not saying deny the possibility of a story. I'm saying don't commit to one's, and this is very much my like I was a child upbringing, where I'm like, we can live in the mystery and that is enough, right? That like it's enough to sort of say, like, it's enough for me, I think, to say to my children, this is going to happen to all of us. It is literally part of life. They are wrapped up in each other and you can't separate them. And we don't know. And you can believe what you want. And I will be down for that. But like, we don't know. It's a belief that you can hold, right? But yeah, I love that you were like, no. But yeah, I hear you about story making and storytelling, but I don't think, and this may be something we table for another day, this question of, does meaning making require a certain kind of emotional or psychological or mental commitment to a singularity, or can meaning making exist in plurality, right?
Yeah, and I think that the idea that there are multiple stories, I mean, I live in that space, right? There are multiple stories, many things are possible. I have all kinds of scenarios in my own head about what might happen when we're next. I'm completely committed to the fact that I'm probably wrong about all of them, and there are different ones, and different times, different things feel more real. No,
go ahead.
I was going to wrap it up. I was really going to say, I think that the thing about this subject is that we could talk about it forever and never get anywhere because ultimately we don't really know. And that's really our in the end, we're defining this big question. I think what liberal religion offers us is a lot of maybes.
Yes. And I want to contend that we can turn those maybes into a satisfying enough answer, and that the satisfaction can be found in opening the space for lots of different ways of telling a story, right? Instead of one narrow vision. Yeah, I feel like we always come around and dance around this topic a lot. So I'm sure we'll be back again. Yeah.
Well, it's good talking to you about it. Bye, Sarah.